Hi everybody, a pleasure to be here. I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, this is the third time I've presented to Renew Melbourne group, so it's good to be back. This is a new variation on my regular energy efficiency talk, so let's see how this goes. Okay, firstly, an introduction. We're going to be talking about what does looking at existing homes tell us about energy efficiency, about comfort, about efficiency, about building practice. So it's basically distilling my observations from about 4 years of looking at homes and trying to make them better. The context here, I've been doing home efficiency assessments professionally since June 2015. And in that time, there's around about 500 houses I've assessed. So the context really relates to homes in Victoria. So to varying degrees, this may apply to other places, but it's specifically with respect to where we are. In that time, I've been doing assessments for ecoMaster, for New Energy Thinking, my own freelance outfit, and NHA Consulting, who I spend most of my time with at the moment. So this is specifically not a comprehensive overview or analysis of home energy efficiency. It's more my take on some of the surprising, unsung, or more important aspects of home efficiency. And it is my own personal opinion only. So I particularly want to acknowledge Morris and Lynn Benet. So I cut my teeth assessing homes with them at ecoMaster. Morris taught me a lot about all this. He's got many more years experience doing it than I have. Okay, let's launch into it. Lesson 1, ignorance is bliss. My observation that very few people want to pay for advice when it comes to their houses, which is unfortunate. Most people are oblivious to how bad their houses really are, and they do need advice. So often it's the people that most need the advice that are the least likely to pay for it. So there's an element of people need to adjust their expectations. In other words, people often don't expect enough of their houses and put up with more than they should. Houses can be a lot better. Lesson about motivations. A lot of people think about dollars, a dollar frame when they think about energy efficiency. But in my experience, dealing with hundreds of homeowners, that's really not what it's about. The main motivating reason why people approach someone to come and get them to improve their house is comfort. It's nearly always the case. And in Victoria, it's nearly always winter thermal comfort that is the big problem. So maybe there's in the order of 3% of customers are doing this because they want to save money, and maybe 2% are doing it primarily for ecological reasons. So thermal discomfort really focuses people's minds. So that's really what gets people doing this, for better or worse. That's my experience. Next lesson. Having seen lots of houses, I've formed the view that a useful way to think about houses are that they are like leaky buckets. Heat flowing through our homes is like water flowing out a leaky bucket. And in this metaphor, each hole represents a different pathway for uncontrolled heat flow: walls, floors, windows, ceilings, and so on. The implications for this is that it's good to think in terms of heat energy, not temperature. Controlling heat flow is like controlling water, in a sense, metaphorically. And with that thinking, it helps us understand how the law of diminishing returns applies. So it's not worth your while going all out fixing one hole if you've got these other holes that haven't been dealt with, for example. Good performance is impossible without fixing all or most of the problems. So in the leaky bucket metaphor, it's still a leak, you know, if you start off with 5 big holes and you fix 3 of them, it's still a leaky bucket. So in other words, it's important to look at the big picture and address, to the extent you can, all the pathways for uncontrolled heat flow. But you know, patch the biggest hole first. You know, it's a good place to start. So think in those terms. You know, what's the biggest hole in your bucket? In other words, what's the dominant pathway for uncontrolled heat flow at your place? And then what's the next biggest hole, and so on, until you've really turned your leaky bucket into something that's a lot more tight. And you know, don't sweat the little things. So this way of thinking can help guide decisions about priorities. When I do ecoMaster assessments, we look at it in these terms, in terms of trying to characterize the heat loss pathways and determine what are the dominant ones, so that people can you know, understand where the heat's going and where to focus their efforts. In that context, it's really important to take the view that the thermal envelope is where a large amount of our effort should be spent, as opposed to perhaps focusing on gadgets. It's really important. Improvements to the thermal envelope, obviously directly reduce energy spend. And that's obvious, but a lot of people sort of stop there. In terms of energy efficiency, improving the thermal envelope can do so much more than just reduce your energy spend. It can make you passively more comfortable. In other words, you can ease off the set point on your heater if the thermal envelope is better. There are fewer hours of the year during which active heating or cooling is necessary if the thermal envelope is better. It makes your house more resilient. So in a climate changing world, it makes our houses more climate safe. In other words, they're not going to become, they're at less risk of being dangerous places in extreme heat waves. Tight thermal envelopes reduces the risk of condensation, so less mold, improved air quality. Heating systems work better. They don't have to work as hard, and they're not blowing on you as much. Less stratification of air. A surprising, perhaps, side effect of having a better thermal envelope is the house will be quieter. There'll be less carriage of noise from the outside to in when all the gaps are plugged and the insulation is better. And likewise, if you're having a party, your neighbours are going to be less disrupted by you as well. And lastly, if you've got a better thermal envelope, you won't need as big a heating or cooling system to begin with. So there's all these other side effects of having a better thermal envelope, well beyond just the simple notion of reducing energy costs. So it sometimes bothers me that this discussion around energy in the popular media seems to be unreasonably focused on reducing costs, but there's so much more to it than that. Another lesson, generalizations often aren't as helpful as you'd think. And I'll use this diagram to illustrate. Diagrams like this often crop up whenever you see talk about energy efficiency. This notion that you've got this proportion of energy going through here and this proportion of energy going through there. And there's a couple of problems with that way of thinking. Firstly, it's useful to think about heat going out different pathways, but it's not that helpful to think of these proportions as good generalizations because they're so incredibly variable. Going from one type of house to another, old house, new house, good house, bad house, these proportions change really, really greatly. Some houses have dominant heat flow through the walls. Others have dominant heat flow through the windows. Often these diagrams, you know, are without insulation, but nearly every house I ever see has some level of insulation in the ceiling. So thinking about this as the dominant pathway for heat flow isn't terribly meaningful when most houses have that pathway at least partially dealt with. So just bear that in mind, that yeah, thinking about different pathways for heat flow is really useful, but thinking about generalized percentages is not. Okay, talking about insulation. Insulation aid insulating. What do I mean by that? The problem is that small gaps can lead to big problems. Here's an example from just on Monday this week. This is from a client's house, and you can see polyester batts. This is looking down at the ceiling. This is the ceiling plaster, ceiling joists, and there are gaps. So in this example, the batts weren't fitting well, the joists were strangely spaced, and there was exposed ceiling plaster. And that's really, really common to see, and it makes a huge difference. And in that house on that morning, that was a thermal image. And what you're hoping to see in a thermal image like this is a sort of a uniform temperature. But it's really patchy, and that's the effect of lots of gaps. And that's a problem. It's a huge problem, bigger than you think. Existing in-roof insulation is insufficient and in poor condition. That's my general take on things, having seen many of them. The impact is it compromises the thermal performance by a degree that you might find surprising. And in doing the home assessments, I generally have to estimate the net effective level of insulation, and it's generally about 1/4 of the minimum recommended. So in other words, a lot of people have a binary view about insulation. In other words, insulated or not. But thinking insulated or not is really not very helpful when you've only got 1/4 of the minimum recommended. And to illustrate that point further, this is a table out of the building code, and it serves the purpose of helping deal with what's called insulation derating. In other words, understanding how much you have to adjust the level of insulation to deal with these gaps that exist. And in this table, if we're aiming for, or if we've got R5 batts, for example, so that's the 5 in that cell there, and we've got 5% on average of the ceiling uncovered, then the net effective level of insulation is only 2.5. Okay? And as the level of insulation you're after goes up, the proportion of uncovered ceiling that you can tolerate drops off to a degree that's quite surprising. In other words, these cells here that are greyed out, you're not allowed to go there. Literally, in the building code, you can't tolerate those proportions of uncoveredness if you're trying to achieve these higher levels of insulation. You're just not allowed to do it, in theory.
How thick is a lateral 5 bat?
Well, that thick. Often you might achieve these levels with 2 layers. But anyway, so there's a disproportionate impact from seemingly quite small amounts of ceiling uncovered, is the point. So culprits, downlights, and here's a particularly egregious example of a downlight because it's got these seeds blown in through gaps that are impinging on this hot halogen light. So this is the insulation coming up to there, and there's this big uninsulated space around it. It's a requirement that large gaps be left around hot downlights. It's absolutely necessary for safety's sake. And this is the example of why, because these things get very hot. Insulation has to stand off from the lights, otherwise you risk a fire. Incomplete initial installation. So here's an example, again, looking down at my feet. That's my foot. So yeah, just big, large swathes of ceiling completely uncovered. And I should emphasize that the slides I'm putting here are not exceptions in the scheme of 500 houses. I see this literally in every single house, or 90+%, let's say. This is really the rule, not the exception. Here's another example, again from this Monday, an extension. So yeah, big sections, no insulation. So insulation here, none there, some over here. And just having these swathes of ceiling uncovered, you know, makes a huge difference. Ducting. So here is a thermograph looking up at a ceiling. You're seeing the ceiling register, big cold spot around it, where what's happened there is the house was built, insulation put in, and then trades have come in to install the ducted air conditioning in this case. And that's the profile of one entire bat that's just been removed. And that's looking at it from the other side. So you can see what they've done. They've literally lifted up the bat, plonked it down there, put their stuff in, and just left it like that. And that's really common practice. That's what you see in almost every case. Now, in an ideal world, they'd take care and bring it back up neatly around the bat, around the vent. Voids. Surprisingly, a lot of houses have these odd internal void spaces that people aren't aware about. And that's just looking down into this void in a house that, you know, you've got insulation here at the ceiling level, but to a large degree, the usefulness of this information, of this insulation, is much less than you like when the unconditioned air from the ceiling can just wander straight down in and impinge on these plaster walls down at personal level. It's not necessarily going into the house, but the heat can exchange easily through those plaster walls. So voids should be insulated is the message there. Bulkhead walls. Lots of houses, especially extensions with rooms up in ceilings, have what I call bulkhead walls. So they're walls that adjoin into ceiling spaces. So this isn't I'm not looking down at a floor, I'm looking across at a ceiling section. So within the ceiling is looking back at the back side of a wall in a client's house. And you can see there's been an attempt to put some insulation in there, and then it just falls out. So this is a section of someone's bedroom where there's just no insulation in behind it. But you generally see these bulkhead walls in second, upstairs rooms. Random damage by trades. So again, this is not uncommon just to see bats strewn around. But maybe once were carefully laid down, but random trades over the years are quite careless. Yeah, I wish that was the exception, but it's not. Steel frames. This is a client recently that had a relatively new house, and you get the thermal imaging camera out and you see this big cold line across the kitchen ceiling where there's a steel frame. So you could have all the insulation you like here and here, but that steel frame's acting as this big thermal bridge carrying heat into the house, or in this example, carrying heat out of the house. Bats still in their bags. And yeah, maybe one house in 10, I see this at, where there's been leftover material, or in some cases not even left over. They just don't want to finish the job. And the client just, they have, the people doing this, I suppose, conclude that it's unlikely that anyone's going to go and realise that the job hasn't been finished. And they just leave bags of bats there. That's the bat with the label on it. And what's even sadder about this is these glass fibre bats can only, the shelf life of them is less than you would think, because their effectiveness to a large extent depends upon them regaining their full loft. Loft is the term used in the industry of basically how fluffy it is when it's laid down and in use. But if it's been sitting in a bag for 5 years, they're compressed in those bags and they're not going to regain their loft. So it's next to useless once it's been there. So if it's just, put it this way, installing that would still be effective as an insulator, but much less effective than it could be if it had been installed properly to begin with. Glass fibre sag, as I call it, and vermin damage is evident here. So older glass fibre bats can just basically sag under their own weight over time, and they may have started off this thick and they end up, and this random sort of discolouring here is basically rat pee. So not very nice, but vermin damage. So the net effect is it's not very useful. So how do we solve this? So in a retrofit situation, so in other words, if we're trying to overcome all those problems in an existing house, step one is usually to replace the downlights, and we'll talk more about downlights in a moment. Try to make good the existing layer of insulation. So finesse the bats that are there to the extent possible using the existing material to put it properly in place, make good the existing layer. So here's an example. This is a layer from ecoMaster, fixing up some bulkhead wall. So this is a bulkhead wall that didn't have any insulation, and she's put polyester bats and strapping it in so it doesn't fall out. Oops. And then add another layer over the top. Usually R2.5 or R3.5 bats over what's existing is the right way to go. And that's, on that same job, what it looks like when you've got decent quality bats put in place over older, insufficient bats. So at the end, you want to target a net effective level of insulation, in my view, of around about 5 to 6. So in context, the minimum recommended level of insulation in Victoria is generally about 4. So going to 5 to 6 as your target is probably a reasonable thing to aim for. Okay, I said I'd talk about downlights, and let's do that. The problem is downlights compromise efficiency in many ways. So first thing, they compromise efficiency of the insulation. So here's a thermograph on a hot day showing this hot spot around a light. There's a hot spot around a vent, like we talked about that. But this is something that's really, really common in houses with downlights. You get these big hot splotches around downlights, and that's carrying heat into houses. And in that example, it's a necessary thing. This hasn't been done wrong, at least to the extent that people are supposed to leave a gap. It's not always done very well, but that's done for safety, as I mentioned. And that's the same thing from above. That's looking down at my feet, and you can see the downlight here. In theory, what's supposed to happen is it's supposed to be a nice radius of about 100 mil or so from the light to leave the minimum clearance required for safety, and then have as much insulation as possible. I never ever see that. What I always see is they've just removed an entire bat or half a bat and leave this big square around a light. So in this case, that's one big square of basically bare plaster with some dust on it that's not got any useful insulation. Downlights permit drafts, so it's really common to have these type of downlight fittings. This is called an MR16 fitting, typically designed to originally have a halogen bulb. This one's been retrofitted with an LED bulb. The original fitting allowed drafts around this ring here, but perversely, in going from a halogen to an LED, it's actually made the draft situation worse, because the bulb itself has a ring of slots around the light that allow for ventilation for cooling of the light. Then there's the obvious problem with downlights is that they're often halogens, which from a lighting efficiency point of view are crap. Then there's a problem with inefficient transformers. So here's a thermal image showing, in this example, this was from just the other day, the client's just turned the light off. You can see there's some residual heat from the light itself. But look at this blob over here. That hot blob is the transformer sitting on the plaster. Yeah, and that's hot enough that my thermal camera can pick it up from inside the house. So in other words, there's often inefficient transformers still in use, even if the light has been changed. So what many people might think of as a single problem being lighting efficiency, when it comes to downlights, it's actually a myriad of problems. They really are evil from an efficiency point of view. So the worst case is these ventilated MR16 fittings with halogen bulbs, but better but still bad, the ventilated fittings with LED bulbs. Again, another example, more clearly showing the ventilation slots around the light. Yeah, so you do see these quite a bit. So the point being here is that some common LED bulbs make the ventilation problem worse. The solution is not to replace the bulb. Don't replace halogen bulbs with LED bulbs is my message. Replace the entire fitting. So that there is this here, okay? This is a good value, modern, sealed downlight unit. I call it sealed in the sense that there's no replaceable bulb. It fits in the same form factor as the one it's replacing. And if it fails, you replace the whole unit. Yeah, in a sec. Some key points about this. If the electrician installs a socket like this on your mains wiring, then this is just an appliance in a socket. So it's legal and safe for mere mortals like us non-electricians to replace these. So if you've got these already in your ceiling, and you might, then you can potentially fit these yourself. If you don't have these already, then you'll need an electrician to fit them in the first place, and then you can replace them yourself if they fail. So these only cost $13 each. They're color temperature selectable, and they have an integral transformer. So they're pretty neat.
What are they called?
Well, generically you call them sealed LED downlight fittings. These are from Reduction Revolution, and they're an Osram brand. The key thing to look out for, the key message here is you cannot assume that it's safe and legal to cover with insulation just because it's a sealed LED unit, okay? You need to see this symbol on the fitting, and as hopefully you can get the picture, that what that's depicting is the light with insulation over it. That tells you that it's safe to cover. If you don't see that, you're not allowed to cover it, okay? And also you generally see the indication IC, meaning insulation contact, meaning it's safe to be in contact with insulation. If you don't see one or the other of those things, don't cover it. It's not safe, even if it's an LED.
Can you run multiple lights from the one socket?
No, you would generally have one per socket. So yeah, so go and ask for an IC rated sealed downlight unit. You can get them. A couple of years ago, these were hard to find. Now they're readily available. Now you know what to ask for. I'll pass that around.
I wonder if they're dimmable.
Yeah, well, these ones are, but there are leading edge dimmable, trailing edge dimmable. So in other words, they're not necessarily dimmable with all dimmers. So you have to have dimmers that are compatible. You may or may not need to replace the dimmer. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, that's true. There are some now with inbuilt dimmers. That's true. Thanks.
What does covering the light do to its life? It's going to get much hotter.
I just blogged about this the other day, and short answer is not necessarily. Yeah, have a look at my blog. And perhaps we can come back to this in the questions if we've got time. But I'm mindful that we don't want to be here all night, and I'll try and get through the thing, and we'll see how we go with time. Okay, next lesson, passive solar design. Homes make poor use of available opportunities to use and control sunlight. That's my general observation. The impact of that is excessive heat loss or heat gain. So culprits, basic design mistakes. So orientation, location of windows. Here's last week's client. In the right of the picture is north. So in other words, this wall is a north-facing wall. So it's such an obvious rookie error that you've got an unshaded wall, north-facing, and it was the one wall of the room that didn't have a window. And the basic passive design principles are take full advantage of the sun. And that was an example of a place that didn't. And in this case, I recommended to the client, as a not an immediate measure to take, but perhaps something to consider down the track is fitting, putting a window in that wall, because it was just an opportunity going begging. Lack of eaves. You see it all the time now. And I presume I don't need to explain why that's a bad thing. Too much shading of windows. This is from that same house in the earlier picture. Al fresco areas, I hate them. So the house didn't originally have this covered area. It had this nice courtyard allowing nice light into the three rooms that adjoined that courtyard. And the previous owners had come along and fitted this, which meant that these rooms became really gloomy, and it removed any opportunity to get direct winter warming into that's a north-facing lounge room window, which would have had some opportunity in the mornings to get direct winter sun, completely gone because of this covered thing. So I presume the people who did that thought they were doing a good thing. And yes, there are situations on a hot summer's day where that might make this place more comfortable, but the lost opportunity to get winter warmth and natural light into the house is just too big a price to pay, in my opinion. So the solution, well, it's hard to retrofit fixes to fundamental design faults, but sometimes you can add a window in that, like in that example I showed a moment ago. Design with the sun in mind. It's really important.
What about taking the iron off and putting laser light on?
Yeah, possibly, but often that'll be that'll give you daylight, but it won't give you direct sunlight to an extent that's useful. Yeah, design with sun in mind. Use the winter sun, block the summer sun. Here's an example. This is not far from here in Carlton. An acquaintance who asked for my advice on a way to make his back room more pleasant. So the idea was to have this pergola arrangement that actually sloped upwards to let the winter sun in come in underneath it. Often these things are horizontal, and then they shade the adjoining living spaces too much. But by slanting it upwards, on a winter's day, you're letting nice warming sun come in underneath that. And in this case, you've got deciduous coverings as well. So I think that works quite well. So I advised on this, but I didn't build it. If I had, I would have made that slope slightly steeper. So it's maybe only 15, 20 degrees slope. 30 degrees would be a good amount. Lesson, window coverings aren't done right. So window coverings are really important. Here's an example. You know, often houses have big windows with no window coverings. Here's another example. This is a, I don't know whether some of you might recognize that. That's the Core 9 house down at Cape Patterson. It's a really great house. I love it. It's 9-star rated. But no window coverings. What the hell? So, yeah. So, as we'll talk about in a minute, just because you've got double glazing doesn't mean you can get away with not putting decent window coverings on. So the impact is excessive uncontrolled heat flow through windows, even double glazed windows. So solution, good window coverings are necessary. Ideally, you want something that can hold a relatively still layer of air against the glass. To do that, you need a couple of things. You need a material that's impervious, impermeable, I should say. And you need a carrier against the architrave that doesn't have a gap. So in other words, you don't want an easy flow of air up through a gap between the carrier and the architrave. Yeah, or a pelmet. Good old-fashioned pelmet. So this is an example of what's called a cellular blind. I'm a big fan of cellular blinds. We'll see some more in a second. So you want that closed at the top. Cellular blinds are good. So that's some cellular blinds that in this example, those are sheer, meaning they let some light in still when they're down. These are the ones at my place looking at on the side. You can see the little pockets of air. So not only do these hold a layer of air against the glass, but they also hold a layer of air within the structure of the blind, which is very effective at adding additional insulation. Okay, moving on. Lesson, leaky houses suck. Poor attention to uncontrolled air pathways is a big problem. And I'm just illustrating that point with a wall vent. The impact is obviously loss of beneficial heat and cools, and potentially the ingress of dust, insects, and noise. So it's more of a problem than you might think. So culprits, poorly sealed external doors. Most houses have a hinged front door. This is the door jamb. This is a door frame. And what I'm pointing out here is a layer of dust in the door jamb that is a telltale sign that it's leaky. In other words, when the door's closed, there's still an air pathway around the jamb and the edge of the door. And you get a bit of a venturi going on when you get a pressure difference between inside and out, and the air drops a line of dust in a characteristic line. When you go home, have a look at your own doors. I bet you'll find one. And what that tells us is doors, when they're closed, don't perfectly seal against the door jamb. There's nearly always a gap. So what you often find is the door, when it's closed, engages properly with the door jamb near the latch, and then the door is very slightly warped. So in other words, if we assume the door jamb is dead straight, then the door is slightly warped and doesn't engage properly with the door jamb at the top and the bottom. So you end up with these pathways for air around the doors, as a result, aren't properly sealed. Fireplaces. I mean, picture tells 1,000 words. That's just camera in, the fireplace looking up, hole to the sky. Obvious big hole. Cavity sliding internal doors. This is at my friend Tim Forsey's place recently when he was doing a blower door test with a little smoke machine. So the house is pressurized and he's getting this big evidence of draught out the cavity where the sliding door is. So in other words, it's hard to seal these things properly. Dishwashers, a big problem. Often you get pathways for air in and around the back of the dishwasher. That can be a real pain to try and fix properly. Exhaust fans. this is an exhaust fan looking from above, obviously. So when the fan is stopped, there's very little stopping, easy pathway for air. So 24/7, you've got a ready exchange of air between the ceiling space and the house, and that's a problem. So I took this photo in my mother's toilet on a hot January day last year. So I don't know whether you can make that out, 47.3 degrees. So I went into the toilet and it felt really hot. And then I just happened to have my thermal camera with me. Well, my thermal camera is a phone with a thermal camera in it. So yeah, not that unusual. It's not as weird as you think that I had a thermal camera with it. So anyway, the point that picture is making is that in that case, the extremely hot air from within the ceiling was impinging into the interior space via the fan. Architrave gaps, you see it all the time. You'd be surprised. Get up on a chair or carefully. Don't break your neck on my account. And if you look at the architraves around doors and windows, at the top, you'll very often find a gap where it hasn't been sealed properly or the architrave has come slightly away from the wall. Sometimes they're big enough to put your little finger in, but more often it's maybe credit card size or 2 credit card thicknesses deep. But because there's such a long length of these, when you add them up all around the house, you end up with a ready exchange of air between inside and out. Pipe penetrations. Obviously, where these pipes are going through, there's pathways for draft. So there's lots of these in nearly every house, and the net effect is you're losing a lot of beneficial heat or cool to outside. The solution: avoid cavity sliding doors. Don't use conventional weather strips because they don't adapt to the warp of the door. Instead of using a weather strip, recommend, at the risk of giving a commercial plug, ecoMaster make this great product called Draft Dodgers. So it's a quality timber carrier with a durable seal that, as you can see in this example, so that's the seal around there against the door frame on the outside and the face of the door there. So it fits neatly and adapts to any warp of the door, and you've got enough latitude in that seal to give a good net effective seal. So I'll pass that around. They come in long strips, and you generally put them on the sides and the top and use something else on the bottom. Cork up architrave gaps and pipe penetrations, upgrade exhaust fans. So here's an exhaust fan fitted with what's called a draft stopper. So it's like a collar that fits over the exhaust fan with a pair of flaps that are held shut under their own weight. And as the fan comes on, the flaps open up and then fall shut under their own weight as the fan turns off.
So where do you buy these draft stoppers?
You can get them from Renew. I think Renew sell them, their web store. ecoMaster sell them. You can get them from the Environment Shop. And yeah, so readily available.
They are available.
Yeah, Bunnings. So they're easy to fit. Not all ceiling fans will accommodate them, but there's a simple example of one that does. Plug up unused fireplaces. So generally, the best way is to get a block of foam rubber and carve it with a knife to make a conformal plug that stuffs up into the. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes. So this as a conformal plug makes something that's removable, but yeah, as per the suggestion, make sure there's some obvious indication that it's present should someone try to light a fire. So further about fires, aside from the fireplace as a source of draft when the fire is not in use, and the fire is a big problem when it's in use as well. So there's a balance that exists between the flue gases that are discharged up the flue and air that's drawn in from outside. In other words, every litre of flue gases has to be balanced for the sake of a pressure with air drawn in from outside. So you can think of it as fires induce drafts. I think of them as draft amplifiers. So the impact is that you can't just think in terms of the warmth coming from the fire. You have to offset that by the cold air that it's drawing in from outside. And we don't have all night to talk about the myriad of other problems with using fires. So the solution is don't use fires.
Is that only open fires though, or is it?
Inducing drafts also applies to some gas fires as well. A modern gas space heater that's just on the wall typically has what's called a power flue or a balance flue. So it's drawing air in for the combustion from outside and then passing the flue gases back out. That's okay. It's not inducing drafts, but some still commonly and widely used gas fires aren't like that. They're drawing air for combustion from within the room, which is in turn inducing drafts from outside. Next lesson, solar hot water is flaky very often. In the course of doing about 500 houses, I've seen quite a few houses that have pre-existing solar hot water systems. And in nearly every case, the existing solar hot water systems I've found to be faulty by the high-tech method of just putting my hand on the valve and seeing that it's completely cold. Okay, this photo was taken. I did a job recently for La Trobe University, who own a bunch of houses, strangely enough, in regional areas. 16 houses were assessed. They all were less than 10 years old. They all had these gas-boosted solar hot water systems. And of the 16 houses, 12 of the systems were faulty. And they're really not very old. They're only average age is about 7 or 8 years. So here's a thermal image of the faulty one. So what you're expecting to see is a nice healthy glow from these fittings and pipes because the tank has some useful warmth from the sun in the tank. But the net effect is the gas booster is doing all the work. So well that the occupants don't notice that it's actually failed. And it's surprisingly common. So many latent faults are out there. The impact is increased energy use, obviously, a false sense of security about using renewable energy, and wasted roof space. In other words, wasted in the sense that it could potentially be better used for solar PV. So the culprits here are the budget flat panel solar hot water units that are really common on a lot of houses. In Victoria, you may be aware that as part of the energy certification for new homes, it's necessary to get either a solar hot water system or rainwater harvesting. And often the builders go for the solar hot water because it's cheaper, but they get the cheapest possible units. And what I've just described is often the net result. So as you go driving down the freeway and you see all these new houses with lots of solar hot water units on the roof, you can reasonably conclude that a high proportion of them are actually faulty. So quality evacuated tube systems are not in this category. They're generally quite good. So these systems are failing in a way that's not often seen because the shortfall is entirely made up by the gas booster. And arguably, this is an unintended consequences of regulations that are otherwise quite good. In other words, the government has said, made it a requirement to do, put the solar hot water or the rainwater harvesting. But as a result, we've got this. And as much as I had to say it, this good regulation has led to what I think is a shame, where there are hundreds of thousands of these faulty units out there and people don't even know it. So from an engineering point of view, that failure mode is in a way, it's a graceful failure in the sense that it's not stopping people getting hot water, but it's because you don't see it, it's a problem.
Is the fault, like where is the fault coming from?
It could be from a number of things, or it could be from the failure of the pump, because these are pumped. It pumps the hot water between the tank and the collector based on a thermostat. So it's either the fault, it would generally be either a faulty pump or a faulty temperature sensor.
It's the apparatus itself that's being manufactured.
Or installed correctly or maintained properly, yeah. So, and often the time and effort needed for a plumber to troubleshoot these things properly could be quite, it could take a good plumber who knows about solid hot water a few hours to fix this. Yeah, Alan, you work with solid hot water. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I guess most of those systems put on new houses are very, like you say, basic.
Yeah.
The cheapest they can get.
Yeah.
Often undersized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely have good quality.
Yeah. Yeah. So my conclusion is in Victoria, don't use solar hot water. And there are other reasons why you shouldn't, but more than just what we've talked about. But keep your roof for PV, and there are other ways of getting efficient hot water. Okay, next lesson. Glazing is a weak link. We talked a bit about glazing in the context of window coverings, but let's talk about the windows themselves. Problem, as I see it, is that people underestimate the problems with single glazing. People probably aren't aware that single glazing is as bad as it is, or if they do, they think that double glazing is a silver bullet that fixes all that. So there's a lack of awareness of secondary glazing, and I'll explain what secondary glazing is in a minute. So the impact is the lack of attention to glazing improvements. So I'll just still the essence of my views about this in this statement that I tell a lot of clients. Going from single to double glazed takes windows from terrible to just being merely bad. Okay. So in other words, double glazed windows aren't good insulators. That's not to say they're not useful, but they're just not sufficient. So in new builds, double glazing is sometimes used to increase the size of windows without actual improvement in the thermal performance. So that's another problem, is that they lead to people putting in windows that are too big. So that's the net takeaway message is double glazing is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So the solution is in new builds, don't overglaze, double glaze if possible. In a retrofit situation, that is an existing house, fit secondary glazing if possible. Explain what secondary glazing is in a sec. And in terms of thinking about windows, think about the glazing and the window coverings as being something that need to be considered together, because they work together to give good thermal performance. So this is an example of secondary glazing. Secondary glazing is distinct from double glazing in that it's something that's added that gives the effect of double glazing. So this is the glass of the existing window. This is the profile just to show the point sitting in the reveal of the existing window. And it's adding a perspex additional layer that's held in place by some new moldings. And that's one type that suits fixed windows. This is an example of ecoMaster's ecoGlaze product. Here's another example. So there are 3 different types, and you can get this stuff from other vendors as well, but this is the ecoMaster product. So imagine this is the existing frame in glass. This is possibly from an awning window, maybe like a wind-out window, or it could be a door. And you want double glaze that. So instead of throwing away an otherwise perfectly good window or door, you get a perspex sheet that fits over, gives you a nice air gap to reduce the heat flow. And that perspex layer is held in place with these magnetically held moldings to give something that's added onto an existing thing, but is quite discreet. Thermally, it performs like double glazing, and it gives you a still air gap, but it's not perfectly sealed. So if that were to ever get some fog up, if it were to ever fog up with a bit of moisture in it, you can unclip it, take it out, wipe it yourself, and pop it back together. So that's the beauty of the system, is that you can actually take it off safely. And that's whereas the existing glazing is glass, the added glazing layer is perspex, so it's safe to handle. So I'll pass that around. Yes, it's perspex, acrylic. Yes. Yes, that one's 5. That one's 5. The third type is 4.
You're recommending on the outside?
It's on the inside.
Yeah,
if it's on,
that's what I use.
Yeah, it needs to be on the inside. Otherwise, it will get too much. Yeah. Too much wind-driven rain will get in and it'll all fog up. Yeah. Indeed. So yeah, secondary glazing is something you should consider to improve the performance of your windows in an existing house. If you've got either timber frame windows or commercial aluminium frame windows, but your generic domestic aluminium frame windows don't suit this because the frame dimensions and configuration generally don't suit it. To put it in context, going from single glaze to double glaze halves, in rough terms, is halving the conductive heat flow through the glass. Okay, so it's measured in U value. Perhaps we won't go there for the sake of time. Okay, just another lesson doesn't relate to the structure of the house itself, but just more about the conduct of assessments. As something I've learned is that people tend to like talking about the house. So there's an element of therapy to this. When you go into a house and you're talking to someone, it's a conversation, and it generally involves some light bulb moments, which tends to be good fun. It's usually quite a rewarding experience for me and the client. An important lesson that I've learned relates to the relative performance of old houses versus new houses. A simple view is that new houses are better than old from a thermal point of view. And that is true, but it's misleading for a couple of reasons. So old houses generally are worse to begin with, but perversely, often the older houses have better scope for improvement. Why is that the case? It's the case because of some practices often seen in newer houses that not seen in old houses. Eaves are missing often in new houses. Big tendency to have much larger windows in newer houses. The prevalence of downlights in newer houses, which have the effect of derating the insulation, as we've discussed. Often newer houses have very shallow truss roofs, and because of the lack of eaves, it tapers down to nothing, basically where the wall is, instead of having a steeper roof that overhangs the wall, and you can actually get out to and reach the top plate of the wall. So in other words, it can be very hard to properly insulate new homes because of that roof design. The truss structure being shallow and a truss and the lack of an eave make it very difficult to get insulation right out where it needs to go of sufficient thickness. Orientation. I challenge you, if you go to a new home display and look at their plans of their generic designer homes, the volume builders will all have plans available. None of the plans will show north on them. In other words, they're telling you is that you can orient that design that they're giving you any which way you like, which is just nonsense. The design needs to take into account orientation to work properly. Alfresco, we talked about alfresco. I think it's a bit of a vogue thing at the moment. A lot of new builds have them, and I think they're a bit of a blight. Slabs are more common. It's not that slabs necessarily lead to bad outcomes, but it is the case that a house built on a slab, once it's built, there's nothing you can do to make the performance of the floor any better than day one, because it's on the ground. Whereas at least with a timber floor on stumps, people can get in underneath and add insulation after the fact. You're not going to be doing that with your slab. So there's a bit of a list of reasons why often older houses have better scope for improving than you might think. So home efficiency should be thought of as a journey. Retrofitting for efficiency takes time. In my case, it took me 6 years. So start the journey. So here's the reality of my own journey. So in this chart, each bar is a month. That you can't make out quite that horizontal scale, but that's 1 year. That's 2006, 2007, so on. So the red parts of each bar are the gas energy, the blue parts are the electrical energy. So what jumps out straight away is there's a lot more energy used in the middle of the year because that's when it's cold. So the energy consumption patterns in Victoria are very seasonal and dominated by gas. So that was my actual measurements, but I believe it's quite typical of houses in Victoria. So it's megajoules on this scale, and that was the last year before I started making significant changes, and the gas plus electricity together was 80 gigajoules of energy. So 2007, started making improvements. So I'm not going to go into what improvements in what year, but I just want to illustrate the trend over years of making improvements. And then, boom, no more gas. Okay, so disconnected from gas here. And look what happened. The electricity use went up, but not by as much as the gas use went down. So the trend was continued. So that's 2012. So when we got rid of the gas heater in the lounge and put in split systems. And then 2013. So compared with 2006, 2013 was 75% less energy. That's gross consumption of the house, not including solar. So in other words, there's solar as well, and that solar fully offsets that remaining energy use. So it's a journey. It'll take years if you're doing it right in a retrofit situation, unless you want to go big bang and spend all the money up front, which most people don't want to do.
So all that solar hot water that you mentioned, that there are better solutions. Would you put in that solar hot water heat pump or evacuated solar tubes?
The former, heat pump. So this is my book, The Energy Freedom Home, that Robin alluded to. It's all described in there, but yeah, in a nutshell, heat pump hot water is the way to go in my view. And yeah, I'd love to talk more about it if you're interested. So I know I've been going an hour, so let's take questions. I think that's. Oh, actually, I thought I was at the end, but there is a bit more. Okay, lesson: windows are there to be opened. Controlled ventilation is important. Consider a default open position as being what you should do. So what's going on here? very often I go into clients' houses and it is apparent straight away that they never open a window. Okay, and to an extent, the fresh air implications of that are mitigated because from the get-go, these houses are really poorly airtight. But if we go and make changes to make the houses airtight and they still don't open the windows, then there's going to be a serious air quality problem. So I encourage people to be very mindful about air quality and the need to open windows for the sake of ventilation. And when you improve your thermal envelope, you'll be much more able to have windows open more readily because the heat that loses is not as much of a problem. So in other words, opening and closing the windows becomes your control. You can control that airflow. The house can be tight when need be for the sake of comfort on really hot or really cold days. But when it's neither too hot nor too cold, then have a window open for the sake of fresh air. I think that's important to state. I think indoor air quality is going to be an aspect of discussion and study, much more so than it has been to date.
Do you want to mention air exchange units in that context?
I don't want to open that can of worms right at the moment. That's a whole other talk by itself. Airtight homes aren't necessarily stuffy. So there's an increased onus on the occupant to ventilate. So if we had all night, there's a whole bunch of other lessons that we could talk about, but I'll just mention them in bullet point form. Ducting sucks. To illustrate that point, here's a client's house with a duct that's split open. Heat pumps are amazing, split systems in particular. Hot water systems, there's enormous scope for houses to save more energy by fitting good hot water systems. Hot water pipes are never properly insulated. It drives me crazy. All electric homes, there's something we should be aspiring to, getting off gas. It ends up being cheaper generally to operate a house efficiently and all electrically. And there's a whole great emissions reduction story that goes with that if people care. So just in conclusion, I wanted to mention this Facebook group. My friend Tim Forsey founded this, and he and I and Jenny Edwards moderate this group. So if you're on Facebook and you want to engage with a really helpful and friendly community of people about these types of issues, jump on there. Oh, by the way, who learned about this talk from the Facebook group? Anyone? Oh, welcome, guys. Nice to see you. I publicised, for the benefit of everyone else, I publicised this talk on the Facebook group. And if you're interested, follow my blog on New Energy Thinking, which I blog about stuff like we've been talking, and those blog posts generally get posted to the Facebook group as well. And if you're interested in all this stuff, I encourage you to buy my book, The Energy Freedom Home, which I was commissioned to write for Beyond Zero Emissions, a local climate not-for-profit. You can get it from Renew's web store. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, if you were building a home, would you put it underground in terms of trying to get the best outcomes that you're trying to achieve?
No, we don't need to, and it would add a lot of cost. So you can make a house that's achieves high thermal performance without needing to go underground, and going underground limits your options for good passive solar gain.